The Business of App Development with Atley Hunter.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and past episodes. Our guest today is none other than Atley Hunter. He's a developer for more than 20 years and over 1,200 publicly released apps across many Microsoft platforms, and is a self-professed professional geek. Atley is a customer-first, proven, driven creator balancing the practicality of requirements with his vast knowledge of platforms, techniques, and a personal hunger for knowledge. He spent many years as a Microsoft MVP, first as one of very few Windows Phone MVPs, and then in Windows development. Atley's contributions to Microsoft technologies through focus groups, speaking at conferences, and interactions with Microsoft product groups is well known in Redmond, Washington. And he successfully led many Agile development teams using his long history of team development to improve processes, productivity, and quality. Atley is also playing with the latest in technology in whatever form it takes to ensure that his customers are, in turn, very well informed with options that will deliver the best solution for their needs. Man, I'm even more excited to talk to you after reading that. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you, Atley.
It's good to be here, Jeffrey.
Yeah, and it truly is impressive that you have published more apps on the Microsoft side of the industry than anybody else in the world. I mean, you've got the top spot.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, I've never heard of anybody that's got any kind of numbers like that. There were a couple that early on were pumping out duplicate apps. So,
Right.
Subway apps for every subway in the world, and basically the same app, different data. But no, they were all individual, unique apps, different use cases, different data points, everything else.
Right. That's pretty impressive. And now you're up in the northern parts of the hemispheres, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm up in Canada. I'm up. I live about 2.5 hours northeast of Toronto, so that's not right in the city, but nice. I'm out in what's called cottage country. So
yeah, beautiful country there. It's pretty white in the winter, I hear.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's pretty white in the winter here.
So I'd like to get back to the Microsoft Store and the progression of that, but how did you begin on that journey? How did your career unfold where you even thought about starting that level of app development?
Well, I wrote an app a long time before. Actually, I started writing mobile apps as soon as things like Palm Pilots and Scions and all those things came out. And I started playing with all those different platforms. And I really love the idea of having the information where I was, where I needed it, being able to do different things. And I really look at the world and how can I optimize what I'm doing? Because to my heart, I'm pretty lazy. It gets right down to it. I don't want to redo anything ever again if I don't have to. So I found that in Windows Mobile, I built an app to keep track of my movie collection, and it actually made quite a bit of money. And when Windows Phone came out, I happened across an email, or someone forwarded me an email from the evangelist for Microsoft Canada at the time in our area, and he was saying that he had a phone for the new platform Microsoft was putting out, and if anybody wanted one of them, to reach out to him. So I sent him an email, and he called me up at my work. I was working for a company in, I think it was Richmond Hill at the time. And So he called me up and we had a conversation. I told him about the movie app, and he actually knew what it was. He'd actually recognized it. He goes, "Oh, well,
Oh, wow.
definitely bring it." And he actually showed up that day at lunch hour with the phone and all the stuff that I needed for the SDK. And he explained the whole program to me. And at the time, it was you could create 10 apps, and then every app you submitted to the store after that was $11.50 to submit. And so I think it took me 2 weeks to create 10 apps.
Yeah.
And I reached out to him and I said, so I've created 10 apps. I guess that's all I'm going to create, because until I see money come in, this doesn't make any sense to start paying to submit these apps.
Right.
So he said, well, hold on, let me see what I can do. And then he reached out to the store team, and then they got me a permission to release 25. And then so I started looking at him like, okay, well, I've got 25. It started to become a goal for me. So I can release 25. Now, okay, then I have to release 25. It wasn't even an option. It was, I'm going to release 25.
Well, what were these initial apps? I mean, what ideas were you coming up with to get those first 10, and what'd you do?
Well, so the first apps that I made were all fairly simple, as most apps back then were very, very simple. They were things that allowed me to sort of explore the technologies, like working with the microphone, working with the maps, working with the cameras, working with, right? So I would find some use case of something cool that I could do with each one of them that would give the user something fun to do or something they could do. So I would look at these different technologies, and I would try to write something that was interesting but focused mainly on the one thing. So they were, like I said, they were fairly simple apps at first, but they all did pretty interesting things. I had one that allowed me to keep track of the garage sales. My wife and I like to go out to garage sales on the weekends to look at little knickknacks and then fix them up and use them for decorating our house. So.
And by the way, for the listeners, Atley is a phenomenal dog lover, and he doesn't do any podcast recordings without the dogs, hanging around. So you'll hear that a little bit now and then. Just know they are beautiful dogs. Sorry,
yeah, that's Geodesic. She's a rescue Dane that we picked up a couple of years ago, and she's a big suck, and she never really wants to be that very far from me. She has separation anxiety, so she's with me pretty much the whole time I'm home. Anyways, so when it came down, so the app for the garage sales, it would allow me to pick the addresses of all the garage sales that we wanted to go to. Then it would pick the most efficient route to go through. So, it was a really simple app. It did some really complex, cool things. And my concept of apps was that they should appear really simple, but do something rather complex and rather interesting in the background. And if you do that, and give the user something very useful and but very easy to do, then you're likely to be successful. And it did end up bearing true in the course of building more and more apps. So I built this spreadsheet and had all the different technologies that I needed. And once I had added a lot of technologies that the application needed, it would create a yellow line for that app in the spreadsheet. Once the apps had the yellow line, I had to then put the branding in it, the icons, the color schemes, the theming, all that stuff. I had decided early on that I was going to create a very, very standard about page, support page, all of those things. So I created those in code so that they could then just be added to whatever project I was in. So all that stuff that normally takes a few days to get your app all tightened up, I could do in a day or two.
Yeah.
So it allowed me to then create all these apps and have these apps ready and then release them in bunches. So I could release in 1 month, I could release 40 or 50 apps.
Oh, wow.
So, but the thing is that as my library became more and more evolved, the ideas that I got, I could write an app very quickly. So I could include advanced animations and really, really nice calculations and great transformations and all sorts of great rich UI as well as data experiences in the application with very little code. So, but it did end up leading to the experience where people go, oh, that's really great. How'd you do that? I'm like, well, I did it once, like 6 months ago. I have to look up the code because now it's just a line of code for me, which is one of the things that I really try to focus on is making reusable code that allows you to really create the experiences quickly and spend more time worrying about the use case and the user story than the how do I get this to work. So, like for example, saving data on a database locally on the machine was always one line of code because I just wrote save whatever this object is, and
right.
the class and the overloads and everything else that was needed to be able to just handle whatever I wanted to do. Do I want to go in roaming storage? That was a setting on it. It wasn't I got to write a roaming storage method there.
Right.
So it really sort of streamlined the process, and it was the only thing that really allowed me to be able to do what I ended up doing, was to create and keep and maintain these apps through, a long period of time and to amass a huge number of downloads.
So you did a lot of apps for Windows Phone, but you've also done apps for the Windows 10 store, right?
Yep.
So what would you say are some of your more popular ones that both for the phone and for Windows 10?
I had one that for the phone that was insanely popular. It was called Watchbox. It allowed you to keep track of what shows you watched and what shows were coming up, and keep track of when things went on hiatus, when they came back. And it was interesting because it was one of my favorite apps because I wrote it to do so much more at my house than it did for people on their phone, even though all the code was still there. Mm-hmm. Because I interacted with a plugin for Plex, and I was able to control what shows I was watching on Plex through that app and everything else. So, a funny app that I wrote a Keynote app that made a just stupid amount of money. And it was really simple. I wrote it on a trip from Toronto to Seattle on a flight. I wrote 90% of it on there. Mm-hmm. And it's a funny story behind it that in it, I wrote the proposal to my wife.
Oh,
my wife actually works with me. She helps me come up with the user experiences and goes through the user story. She worked for Deloitte for a long time as a technical QA person.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a bug into the app that if you play the app a certain way for a certain period of time, it would pop up a really ugly dialog box that says, would you really marry a guy that makes apps that look this ugly? And so that's how I proposed to her. And the funny thing is I left it in the app, and that app ended up paying for our wedding.
Wow. That's awesome.
So it was rather a cute story. So there's a number of them. One of the things that I've always done, though, is that I have a whole bunch of different store accounts, and I don't talk a lot about necessarily my apps, because one of the things that I've spent years doing is working to perfect my knowledge on what works and what doesn't work in the store, because it ends up being much more complicated than most people realize, which is why most people don't make much money in the store. Like very, very few developers make much more than, a few dollars in the store, if they make anything. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I was able, through my research, to understand why ads don't make anywhere near as much money as people think they'll make, because it comes down to how you design, how you architect your application. You can actually architect to make ads more worthwhile. And so I did a talk about that actually at one of the MVP summits, and I had people from different companies that do the ads, that supply the ads to developers. And I remember doing the talk, and then looking over at the person that owns one of these companies, and he's just looking at me just like this. I'm like, am I wrong about doing this? He goes, nope. Which is funny, because they wouldn't publicly tell anybody these things, because it was part of how they did business. So but that's one of the reasons why I have so many different accounts, is because branding. But also I don't talk too much about my apps, because it skews the numbers on what works and what doesn't work. So there's certain apps that that are popular and they're doing well, but I don't talk about, because as soon as I start talking about them, then I can't count them in any of my research.
Okay. Well, are there any Windows 10 apps that our listeners could just look up and download, because a lot of other people have found them useful?
I would have to look and see. Because most of my apps were really for the phone, and I've actually pulled a bunch of apps down from the platform. I do have some. I'd definitely send you some links.
Okay. So let's talk about the mobile apps. But have you converted any of them to iOS or Android, or have you stuck with just Windows?
I did early on. I did some iOS and some Android apps. I did some iOS apps using Objective-C, which I found very painful, very long development cycle. And I did some apps for Android, but I found that I didn't make anywhere near as much money on those platforms as I did on Windows, just because it was a newer platform. I had gotten in earlier on it, and it was um, the users had sort of the desire to spend money like Apple users had, but the store at the time had better discoverability than Apple had. It's one of the things that really made me sad about the platform, because there were so many things about the platform that even now, as I'm trying to find out what I'm going to use next, I struggle with both of the other platforms because there's just so many things that they don't have that the Windows platform has
Okay.
even now. So
there's definitely the consumer paid side, but then a lot of people are thinking, okay, do I make a Xamarin app just for my business, for my own users?
yeah.
And so from a technical perspective, and you're probably one of the top Xamarin experts out there in how to actually put those types of applications together, whether or not you would publish it to the store for a paid app or just, have it for your own users. What are some of the tips or the secrets? And definitely you had a lot of code reuse, and how'd you manage that?
Well, so for Xamarin ends up being a great solution for businesses because it does allow you to do a great percentage of your apps, and a great percentage of business apps can be done using Xamarin because it does allow for a lot of code reuse across the platforms. It also has a fairly high bar for where you'll end up having to write custom code. It usually ends up coming out in the UI when you want to do unique or custom controls for a platform. So you end up doing these things called custom renderers. Now, with the latest version of Xamarin, they've actually improved that even more. So there's even less use of custom renders in the newer version. So I'm excited to be playing around with that. But as far as making a Xamarin app effectively, you just, if you follow the best practices for creating reusable and manageable code, you'll probably do very well with Xamarin. And I've always found it extremely useful. And it's got a fairly quick development cycle. It's a little bit different than developing with straight Windows like XAML and C#, but it's not that much different, and it seems to get closer and closer all the time. So I find it to be very effective. I prefer to use it over some of the other like JavaScript based ones or some of the other ones, although some of those are very popular as well. It's just a matter of making sure that you use the technologies you're familiar with and building the best solution.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So there's several Xamarin options, and there's Xamarin Forms. So what flavor should people really be looking at for folks who's, okay, I heard of Xamarin, I've been a C# programmer for a long time. What should I reach for, and what should I kind of leave to the side just initially?
Well, it's one of those. It's really hard to come up with the all-encompassing. This is the one path you always choose.
Well, let's constrain it. Let's just say, okay, regular a business app. I'm going to know my users. Have a backend service I can put APIs on to call into, and I need to manipulate some data, and somebody's going to be walking around with a tablet or a phone.
Yeah, well, Xamarin Forms is great for that. I mean, that ends up being a really good case for creating a Xamarin Forms project and running it through that. You can do a lot of customization. You can get the data use. There's a lot of great libraries that you can attach to and shorten your development cycle as well. Any
favorite libraries that are on the tip of your brain?
I think the standard ones, the Prism's great. You got, if you're going to be using MVVM and and Xamarin, you're probably going to want to be using Prism to give yourself the ability to use dependency injection and give yourself the ability to do proper architecture, proper design, software design.
Okay. And you mentioned the just general software best practices for code reuse. For someone listening and think, yes, I want to use those. What are they? What would you point them to?
Well, okay, so some of the ones are some of the ones that I try to find or I try to follow the most are don't make methods too large. Methods should be small. They should be reusable. You should be looking at making sure that your signatures are properly named and structured so that you understand what they're doing. Make sure that I comment my code. There seems to be a bit of a kickback right now where people are like, no, we don't comment our code. We just name everything so that it seems obvious. But I still prefer commenting the code. And if you comment it properly, Visual Studio will give you all of those prompts while you're writing your code. So when you're using something, it's much easier to follow along.
So you're talking about the XML comments on the method and class signatures.
Exactly. Yes.
So that the IntelliSense pops it up.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you do the summary at the top, it will pop that up, and it'll also pop up all the information for all of your signature, your variables in your signature. So I find that incredibly useful, especially when, as I tend to do, I build a library, and as it gets larger and older, I don't necessarily remember what all of the things were that I wrote 6 months ago or a year ago. I've written an awful lot of code since then. So proper commenting of it and having it pop up in IntelliSense for me is incredibly helpful, and allows me to keep writing clean code because I'm not moving things around. Or one of my biggest I guess sticking points is I never copy more than 3 lines of code. If it's 3 lines of code or more, then it needs to be a method. It needs to be its own method. You call it somehow. You refer to it from other places. If you're copying 5, 6, 7 lines of code from one place to another, and then you find you've got some issue somewhere in that, you've got to go in and remember all those places you did that code. And it just ends up being, the worst way to do it. It really cuts down on the maintainability. So it's not just to make the code reusable. You've got to make it maintainable so that it can be easily maintained. I have not been in a single project with a third party yet where I haven't gone, wow, you guys have a serious amount of technical debt. And when are we going to fix this? And that's the part. It's just like when it comes to working on projects, the thing that always suffers, the first things that suffers are the commenting. First things that suffer are the testing.
Yeah.
The second thing that suffer is the commenting. And the third thing that suffers is the technical debt. Oh, we'll just leave that proof of concept in there. And now that's released code. And that to me ends up being the things I stay away from. And if you stay away from those things, you're more than likely going to be writing much better code.
Yeah. Okay. So with writing so many apps, were those all in Xamarin, or were some of them outside of Xamarin?
No. So the majority of my apps I wrote for Windows Phone. I wrote for Windows Phone and for Windows. I wrote some for Windows, but I wrote a great majority of them for Windows Phone. I wrote a bunch for Xamarin, but mostly for third-party companies. So I wrote some for myself for Xamarin. I'm actually starting to work on traversing some of my library out to Xamarin so that I can start rewriting some of the apps that I want, because I have probably about 70 apps that I use on my devices that I will be converting to either iOS or Xamarin, whichever one I use, probably Android at this point. And I've already put a call out to people that I know, which of my apps do you want to see on Xamarin first out on Android? So there will be a lot more Xamarin development in my very, very near future. Mm-hmm. So, and it'll be stuff that I'm releasing for myself. So.
Gotcha. So with this being a DevOps podcast, probably a lot of listeners thinking, wow, that's a lot of apps. What does the development environment look like for a mobile app? And how do I deploy and how do I keep tabs on how it's being used and exceptions? And what tips could you provide there?
Well, so I used Flurry for the longest time, and then ended up switching over to App Center. And that gives me a lot of ability to track what's going on in my apps. One of the things that
Azure App Center.
Yes, Azure App Center. One of the things that I found to be very helpful was being able to manage how my users were using the apps, or understand how users are using the apps for me to make better apps, both with the ones that need to be changed and the ones going forward. One of the things I've always said is developers tend to be a little narcissistic. We design what we think are perfect solutions, and we say, okay, this is how you're going to do this thing now.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily how users are going to want to do it. And so we've all had software that we've used begrudgingly because it sucks for the way we want to do things, but it's the only option we have. And so I've always tried to keep myself from developing solutions like that that people would have to use in spite of what they would rather be doing.
So with Visual Studio, I guess it's called Visual Studio App Center now, but it's part of Azure. What's your opinion on that versus Azure Pipelines, and where do the two come together?
Well, I haven't really played a lot as much as I should with Azure Pipelines. The App Center, though, gives me the ability to work with my deployments, to work with my. It's more for me. It's more important for me to understand what's going on in my app, what's happening, the crashes, the errors that are happening, the user experiences that are happening, putting in flags for when certain events happen or certain things happen, so that I can track why certain things are happening or what's happening. The big thing that, especially for an independent app developer, that you want to be aware of is making sure that you're not bleeding money and supporting the app when it comes to things like data structures. So if you have an Azure data store, and you've got your app going back and forth to it too many times when it doesn't need to, you can very easily have architected yourself out of the ability to be successful with that app, that the app will never actually make money, it'll cost money. So things like that, using the tools in App Center, using the tools that are provided to track, why things are happening and when things are happening, and just being aware. One of the biggest challenges, I think, as an app developer was to change my perspective from just wanting to write all the code to having to understand the business side of it, and understand, the customer service side, and understand the user side of it. It changed and widened my perspective greatly to how the whole thing goes together. Because historically, as a software developer, you work in a company and you're just told, build this, and you go build that. It's someone else that markets it. It's someone else that supports it. It's someone else that does all of these things. But as an app developer, it's all you, unless, of course, you're working for a company. So it actually really changed my perspective on how I develop software, because you develop software differently when you have to support it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is for sure. And whether it's bringing the ops team together with the development team, creating one to support it, but or an app that's running on a computer that you don't control, it's just like desktop software, to the extent that somebody else installed it, and if it blows up, you have no way of knowing unless you've designed that in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that the thing that shifted my ability to work for myself and write apps, and that would be my full-time job, ended up being when I started actively both checking what was happening with my app, but also reaching out to the user base and trying to open a dialogue with them to make sure that I understood really what they needed. And what I realized is that I had probably written about 70, 80 apps by this point, and I thought, I'm really good at this. I know what I'm doing. And it wasn't until I reached out to my user base that I realized I really didn't know what the hell I was doing.
Yeah.
And so it really changed my whole perspective. And you've got to be willing to look at that and take the criticism and take the lumps. I remember one of the best emails I ever got, probably one of the most valuable emails I ever got, was from a guy who sent me an email that was one line. It was like, it's a piece of S.
Yeah.
And what I did was I reached back out to him, and I already knew why he said that. I knew exactly what was wrong with the app at the time, but I reached out to him as if I didn't know, and I let him tell me why. And I could have assumed that it was just my error because I knew there was an error. I knew there's a bug in the program when I released it. I wanted to get it out, and I knew I was going to put out a fix very shortly afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So not only did he tell me that bug, but he also told me something else I wasn't aware of. So I ended up fixing two things and making it a lot better.
Oh, nice.
And he ended up becoming one of my best testers for a long time. And it's that sort of attitude, that ability to take someone calling you an idiot and then going, okay, so he's got a reason for calling me an idiot. What is his reason? Other than just going, he's calling me an idiot because he's an ass.
Yeah, right.
And you, once you get past that point, you're able to sort of reflect and say, oh, okay, well, yeah, from his perspective, this is all he knows about me, and this was idiotic. I need to do this better. So the ability to take that and understand it and build from it really, I think, is what separates the developers that are going to be successful, highly successful, from the ones that will be less successful.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've talked about the App Store, and we've talked about reusable code, but with so many games and that success, you got some unique takes on interacting with users.
Well, yeah, I think that the way I interact with the users, I try to engage them. I try to pull as much information out of them as I can, because they know how to write software, or they know how to create the experience they want better than I ever will. And my job as a developer, whether I'm writing apps or writing a business piece of software for work or whatever, is that I have to understand them, or I have to get as much of that information from them as I can. I have done crazy things to try and make users give me feedback. I have, for example, in the Keynote app, I have a thing where I just put in a send me any piece of, like, send me some feedback and I'll send you 100 coins for Keynote, or 10 coins, or whatever it is for Keynote. And I had an email. I had a guy that would send me emails, about 150 emails a day, and they would just be gibberish and garbage. And the funny thing is, I just wrote a script that every time he sent me an email, it just sent him money back. It just sent him coins back for it. Because for all the people that'll do that, there were a couple of people that sent me truly useful information that really helped me to bring my software forward. And one of the things I always laugh about when people write games and they say, oh, well, we've got this and we've got that, and it's all these made up currencies and these made up gems and this and that. That's imaginary. You made that up. It has no intrinsic value other than what you've given it.
Yeah.
And I found that in order for my app to actually make any money, I had to give an awful lot of those coins away, because we've all seen apps and games and things where you do something and then 5 minutes later it's like, hey, $5 and you can continue playing this game. And they're like, well, I'm deleting that game. And that's what happens. But when you interact with people and you understand sort of what their needs are and what their wants are, then you start changing the way your software is developed. So, for example, the games where I was just giving away tons of free coins, well, then I made sure there were ads in it. And I made sure that there were other stopgaps that made me money in different ways. And I even made a thing where you watch this, and this was right near the beginning of this, watch this ad and you'll get these free gems. And that's very popular now. But it's all of those things where if you look at why people are doing things and what people want, and a lot of times it's completely different than what you think it is and why you think it is. And you're not going to find that out unless you try to reach out to people. I would sit in airplanes and or in airports while I was waiting for flights, and I'd see someone fiddling around with something. I'd go, oh, what game is that? Or what app are you using? And this and that. And I'd strike up conversations. I'd ask them, what do you like about the phone? What do you hate about the phone? What's the worst? What's the best? And I would try to honestly get true feedback from these people that I've never met.
And they thought you were just a friendly guy. Here you were researching them.
I was doing research.
Hey, it worked.
I am a friendly guy, but the thing is that you can't do some research.
No, it worked.
And it really worked. It taught me so much about different things when I looked at how different people did things. And the more people I encountered, especially like that, and I meant like my favorite thing is to find non-technical people that are frustrated with technology and find out why. Because for me, that gives me all of these different ideas and ways that I can make sure that I'm not frustrating people with my technology.
Well, Atley, as we wrap up here, you've mentioned some resources, but are there any other resources that our listeners should follow up on?
Well, if you're not already playing around in Azure, you should definitely be checking it out because there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a ton of services, the data services that they've got, the App Center, all of those things. You should be exploring those. Right now, I'm sort of getting around and playing around with IoT and bots because I really think that there's a lot of growth and there's a lot of potential in that area. So for me, that's sort of what I'm working on next. Once I finish porting a whole bunch of apps to another platform, and but as far as resources for apps, I think that you should be checking out Xamarin. Xamarin is if you're a C# developer, if you're a WinForms or a web developer that's been running on the Microsoft stack for a long time, it will help you in a long way to sort of evolve into developing apps and expanding what you want to do. But my biggest advice for developers is set aside some time for yourself every once in a while to go out and poke around in new technology that's way out of your wheelhouse. Because if you don't, you may end up losing why you loved doing development in the first place.
Good advice. Well, this was fun. Hey, thanks so much, Atley, for visiting with me.
I'm happy to.
Awesome. And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.